Hello, everyone. My name is Liza Saffo, and I am a children's crisis clinician at the Florida Center for Early Childhood. On today's webinar, I'll be answering the question, is COVID-19 traumatizing our children? The short answer is yes, but throughout this presentation, I'm going to provide a more in-depth look at the ways in which natural disasters like COVID-19 impact children and the degree to which they may experience traumatic stress reactions. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a kind of general definition of what childhood trauma is, for those of you who may not be as well versed in the topic. A traumatic event is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. Children who suffer from child traumatic stress are those who have been exposed to one or more traumas over the course of their lives and develop reactions that persist and affect their daily lives after the events have ended. Traumatic reactions can include a variety of responses in children. This definition comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is a great place to find resources on childhood trauma. As we move through this presentation, I'm going to discuss the various reactions more in depth. Natural disasters as a form of trauma. So when we think about COVID-19, we know that it's a widespread pandemic that is affecting all of us to some degree worldwide. This pandemic can be considered a natural disaster. Natural disasters can lead to a variety of adversities for children and families. Adversities can include displacement, loss of home, personal property, inability to attend school, economic hardship, loss of community and social supports, illness, death of a loved one. These are a variety of things that different children and families might be going through. A big one for children right now is their inability to attend school. Unfortunately, in today's world, we know that many children feel safer at school than they may at home. School is where they go to socialize, to learn, to cultivate their social emotional skills, to create bonds with trusting adults. And for many children, it's where they get the majority of their meals. So because this pandemic, was fairly sudden, children didn't get the opportunity to acclimate to the changes. They didn't get the opportunity to say goodbye to their friends or to their teachers, or to attend, any of the end of the year parties that they worked for, graduations and those sort of things. What we know is that humans aren't meant to be socially isolated from others. So children who have been used to socializing and playing with other children are now suddenly confined to their homes and, with their family members for a long period of time. And this sudden change in human connection can and does often impact our little ones. And that impact is seen to be even greater for those children whose families may have lost their home or their job during this time, or even worse, experienced, illness or death of a loved one. So there's 6 risk and protective factors that I'm going to go over in the coming slides. And these kind of help us to understand, what is going to create a more likelihood that a child might have a traumatic stress reaction to this current crisis or not. These risk and protective factors include the severity of the event, the proximity or exposure to the event, the caregiver impact and reactions of the caregiver, a prior history of trauma in the child, any family and community factors, and then of course, age or developmental stage. So first I'll discuss severity of the event. So here are some questions we would want to ask in relation to that. How badly was the child or someone they love physically impacted by the virus? Did they or someone they love get diagnosed with COVID-19, and did that person have to go to the hospital? Were children separated from their caregivers due to the virus? And does the child's caregiver perform a job as an essential worker? So in terms of being separated from caregivers, that could be for a large number of different reasons. Maybe a parent or caregiver fell ill because of the virus and had to go to the hospital and has been sick for several weeks and not in the home. Or maybe parent or caregiver is an essential worker and they don't want to come home and infect their families after, their day's work, and they might be staying somewhere else and isolating somewhere outside of the family home. In which case that disrupts this child's normal, life of seeing their parent when they get home from work or that sort of thing. Or maybe the parent and caregiver is an essential worker who has to be working extra hours. They work at a grocery store who needs extra staffing right now. And so the child might not be seeing their parent as much and might also be having that fear around their parent being out and potentially more likely to get the virus because they are out in public spaces doing an essential job. The next factor is proximity to the event. Does the child live in an area highly impacted by COVID-19 infections and death? I use the example here of New York and Washington because we know those were two areas that have been, increasingly impacted. And that isn't to say that there isn't other places around the country and around the world that are greatly impacted as well. I just use those ones as an example because I think children who are closer in that area are going to show different responses than a child who might be more distant from the events going on today. Does the child reside near a hospital? One thing I've noticed or heard from others is if you're living near a hospital during this time, you're hearing more sirens and ambulances or more life flight helicopters landing and those sort of things. And just having those sounds, which for all of us signals to our brain an emergency or a crisis, hearing that more often is going to create a sense of anxiety or discomfort, feeling unsafe maybe among our children. So we want to be aware of that. And, there are areas as well that I've read about where families are living in areas located right outside of a hospital potentially. So they're seeing ambulances pull up constantly and be wheeling people in and out. And these are very sick people, maybe even some people who have already passed away. And so if that's right outside your window, there's not a lot one can do to escape that. And so, children that are closer in proximity to areas like that, we want to make sure that we're especially providing them the extra supports that they need. I have here, did the child witness a loved one fall ill or die as a result of the virus? And do the people closest to the child spend a large amount of time talking about or watching media related to COVID-19 while the child is present? This is a big one that I want to touch on because, as adults, we do need to stay informed so that we can keep ourselves safe and healthy and keep our families and our children safe and healthy. So there is, a degree to which we want to stay informed. But we want to make sure we're not overloading kids with having, the TV or the media playing loudly in the background all the time. Or having adult conversations about COVID-19 while children are present. And I know this can be difficult because many of us live in small quarters and we're all home together all the time. And so it can be hard to separate it out. But a thought that I had is it might be more beneficial to receive your news through a reading outlet if that's available to you, in which case you'd be reading the information and kind of retaining it yourself versus having the sound kind of going through the house. And as much as we think children may not be listening or retaining, what's going on around them, you'd be surprised how much children actually do listen and pick up on things. And even if that's subconsciously just having it going on in the background, it's coming into their psyche to some degree, and it can be fostering those feelings of unsafety and anxiety. So we want to be cognizant of that and stay informed while also balancing out not having, it be a topic that's consistently being talked about or brought up. And that I'll add, that isn't to say that we're not having conversations with our children about COVID-19 and health concerns. We are definitely doing that, and I'm going to get to that very soon here. So the next factor we want to look at is caregiver impact and reactions. So some questions we would ask here is, did caregivers take the child's reactions to the pandemic seriously and validate their emotions? What we don't want to do during this time is make statements to children that sound like, oh, you'll be fine, there's nothing to be worried about, or I don't know what you're so scared of, none of us are sick. We want to validate their feelings. They do have a reason to be afraid. They do have a reason to be fearful and scared because there's a lot of uncertainty around us right now. And so it might sound like a reaction like that to tell children there's nothing to worry about will help them, but it actually won't. What it does is it fosters them not expressing how they feel anymore, and then keeping that to themselves, which then increases that likelihood of some of these traumatic stress reactions. So we want to take their reaction seriously, and we want to validate their emotions and let them know, yeah, like it is a difficult time, and we do have, these reasons to feel afraid, but we're doing everything in our power to, wash our hands as much as we can and wear safety gear when we go outside and social distance. And we're doing all these things to try and make sure that we stay as safe as we can as a family, so we can reassure them while still validating how they're feeling. The next one is, how did caregivers respond to the child's needs as well as to their own? This might sound cliche, but like they say on the airplane, put your oxygen mask on first before putting one on your child. And the reason behind that is we can't take care of our children or be the best version of ourselves for our children if we're not taking care of ourselves first. And, I don't think any of us are perfect adults or any of us are perfect parents, but if we can do our best to take care of ourselves as much as we can during this difficult time, we will be better versions of ourselves for our children who really, really need us during the COVID-19 crisis. The third one here is, did caregivers approach behavior changes in children with compassion versus a disciplinary approach? In the following slides to come, I'm going to go over some of the possible behavior changes that you might see in your children as a response to this natural disaster. But we want to make sure that we're approaching any changes in behavior with compassion versus punitively. I mean, we obviously want to keep, things in line and some structure in the home, but children are having a difficult time right now. And I think the best thing we can do as adults and caregivers and people who care for children is show them as much compassion as we probably can, and show ourselves as much compassion as we possibly can as well. And then lastly, did caregivers have open conversations with children about COVID-19 and encourage questions? This is also very important. We want to set up a platform where children feel comfortable coming to us and asking us questions and talking about COVID-19 and what's happening. I think even as an adult, I feel very confused by it at times. So I can only imagine how our children at all different developmental stages, how they're feeling about it. So we want to have these open discussions with them. We don't want to shut them down and make them feel like they're too young to, talk about this, because the reality of it is it's impacting everybody regardless of age. So we want to have these open conversations. We want to encourage questions, and we want to make sure that we're answering the questions as truthfully as we can. So, if a child says to you, Daddy, could you get sick and die? Which might be a very possible question a child could ask. How you would want to respond to that would be, there's a possibility that any of us could get sick, at any time, but with everything that we're doing and all the safety precautions that we're taking, and how much, we're working to keep this family safe and sanitary and clean, we're hoping that all this work that we're doing will lead to us, staying safe and staying healthy. And so we want you to know we're doing everything we can to keep, ourselves and our children and our family safe. Next here, as another factor, we have prior history of trauma. So this is also known as adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. A prior history of trauma is a risk factor during this time. Adverse childhood experiences, also known as the ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. ACEs can include abuse, violence, growing up in a family with mental health issues or substance abuse issues. And the stress from ACEs can change brain development and how the body responds to stress. So if we're working with children who already have several ACEs, they're more likely to develop a traumatic stress response to the current pandemic than children who may not have any or who have fewer. So we want to make sure to keep that in mind. Family and community factors. So, culture, race, and ethnicity of children and families can be both a protective factor or a risk factor, depending on a couple different things. Many times the cultural identity of a child and their family provides a sense of community, whether it be around foods, faith, traditions, or customs. But on the other end of the spectrum, children and families who experience racism or discrimination because of their culture or the color of their skin or their language or accent or whatever it may be, this becomes a great risk factor. Racism and discrimination is a form of trauma that can be internalized and have lasting effects on children. And I also mentioned here the health disparities, that are resulting from systemic racism and oppression over time. And so the statistics and research have shown, as it relates to COVID-19, that people of color are more likely to get infected with the virus and potentially die from it, not because of genetic factors, but because of the long-standing health disparities in this country and around the world. Because of racism and discrimination, communities of color are more likely to suffer from socioeconomic disadvantages, which in turn results in lack of access to good health care, healthy foods, living in areas with healthy air to breathe in. And so we need to be hyper aware of this when caring for and working with children of color during this time. So the next couple slides after this, I will be kind of going over some possible psychological impacts that we might see in children as a result of this natural disaster of COVID-19. But before I go into some of those possible behavior changes, I wanted to remind everyone about the spectrum of impact as it relates to trauma. Each child is unique and different, and just because a child may have undergone several ACEs does not necessarily mean that they're going to display all the behaviors I'm about to cover. And on the other hand, just because a child maybe has never experienced any ACEs doesn't mean that they won't suddenly show some traumatic stress reactions to the current crisis. We have statistics and research that provides information based on factors of likelihood, but it's important to remember that each individual child is different and unique, and the impact of trauma shows up differently for each of them. Okay, so these are the age and developmental stages I'm going to cover. Psychological reactions of children experiencing a disaster or emergency situation vary depending on age and developmental stage. The age group breakdown that I'm going to cover is as follows: 0 to 2 years old, 3 to 5 years old, 6 to 11 years old, and then 12 to 18 years old. So possible psychological reactions for 0 to 2-year-old children. These might look like agitated state, frequent crying, excessive clinginess to caregivers, sleep difficulty, regressive behavior, and or unjustified crying or agitation. And by unjustified, I don't mean there's not a reason behind it. It may just look to us as the adult that we can't understand where it's coming from. And obviously children in 0 to 2 years old, they're not going to understand what COVID-19 is or what a pandemic is or illnesses and death and those sort of things. But what they are going to pick up on is their environment and the reactions of their caregivers who they rely on completely. The second age group that we're going to be covering is children 3 to 5 years old and any possible psychological reactions that you might see in this developmental stage. These could include behavioral changes, passivity, irritability, and restlessness. There could be excessive fear of particular stimuli. This could be real people in situations or imaginary ones. We know that children in this age group, this is when their imagination is building and when they're using that. So whether it's imaginary or a real fear, we want to make sure that we're validating them and helping them to get through this difficult time. Some other psychological reactions we might see are spatial disorientation, sleep and eating disturbances, regressive behaviors, which could look like bedwetting, baby talk, and thumb sucking. With regressive behaviors, we want to make sure to show compassion and not shame children, because these can be, embarrassing things, but children will sometimes revert back to some of these behaviors to find a sense of safety around them. And then finally, repetitive play enactment of the traumatic event. Children express themselves through play. So you might see your children or children that you're working with, reenacting a big germ monster, COVID-19 monster, infecting all the people or something like that through play. And we don't want to squash children from doing that or tell them not to do that. If anything, that's how they're processing and working through it. And play is a great time for them to express how they're feeling. Possible psychological reactions for children ages 6 to 11 years old. Possible behavioral changes might be passivity, aggressiveness, or irritability. We have to remember that children are used to being at school and socializing and recess and after school activities. And, right now they're stuck in home in isolation. And so being, showing some irritability or aggressiveness is normal at this time. You might also see confusion and disorientation, frequent crying, regressive behaviors again, difficulty keeping still and focusing attention. I've noticed a lot of the children I'm working with right now have shared that they're having difficulty concentrating on their academic work, now studying virtually and attending school virtually. This was a big change and transition for children, and it's been difficult for them to concentrate. And so we want to have compassion for that and validate it. Headaches and other somatic complaints. We know anxiety can foster physical ailments. So if children are complaining about headaches or tummy aches and those sort of things, it could be a result of extra anxiety and stress that they're undergoing. Feelings of guilt or beliefs that the disaster is a consequence of something they have done or thought. We want to make sure that we let children know that they didn't do anything wrong. This had nothing to do with anything they ever did or thought, and that it's something that we're all having to go through, together. They may look withdrawn or shy. Some children are typically very happy and bubbly, but during this time they may not have the energy to be that way because they're, feeling tired from being stressed out and feeling anxious and having things be so different during this time. And then finally, again, repetitive play enactment of the traumatic event. And of course, play enactment for this age group is going to look different than 3 to 5 year olds, but still, if they're reenacting some of these things and crises that are happening in our world, it's showing that they're trying to work through it through play, and we want to honor that. Possible psychological reactions for our teens, 12 to 18 years old. So this can look like confusion and disorientation, withdrawal or refusal to speak, daydreaming or looking distracted, a loss of appetite or sleep, loss of interest in usual activities, potential behavioral problems, potential rebellious behaviors against family or authority, and escaping from home. As I look at some of these possible reactions, I can't help but notice that some of them are just typical to this age group of adolescents as it is, with the changes that they're going through. Preteens and teenagers, this is a time where they're kind of forming their identity and they want to be with their friends and in social settings, and they're less likely to want to be stuck at home with their family or their parents. So if you see some of these reactions, I mean, part of that is normal stuff in teens as it is, but we might see it at an even more extreme rate just given the situation that we're going through right now, and teenagers having to grapple with not being able to be surrounded by various support systems that they had relied on before. And most importantly, how can we help children during COVID-19? First, we need to understand these emotional reactions that I just went over. We want to make sure we're paying attention to a change in behaviors at home. Previously, any changes in behavior amongst children would also be seen by teachers or staff members at school or counselors. And right now, the only people really having eyes on our children are caregivers and parents at home with them. So we want to make sure we're paying attention to any changes in behavior, and we want to acknowledge and accept behavior as normal adaptations to stress. We don't want to make them feel guilty or bad about the way that some of their behaviors have changed. Of course, if you see behavior changes getting so extreme that it could impact the child's safety or well-being, that's when you want to reach out for extra support. So, in cases of any thoughts of wanting to hurt themselves or somebody else, or somatic symptoms so severe that they can't eat or sleep, those are things where you'd want to, reach out for some extra support from professionals. But some of the everyday kind of behavioral changes that I mentioned before are pretty normal during this time. B, we want to reduce the emotional impact. So we want to provide support, comfort, and time for play and discussion. Setting aside time for just play and hanging out with your children is really important right now. I know that all of us have a lot on our plates and a lot going on, and adding playtime probably seems like an extra thing that no one has time for, but it really will, foster more resiliency in our children and give them an outlet for relaxation and some more, peace and time to just play and be children. So I would highly recommend setting aside some time, daily or weekly for play and family discussion around, what's happening in our world. Adults and parents want to make sure they're modeling healthy coping behaviors. And, I don't think any of us are perfect adults or parents, right now, especially with everything going on. And, we're struggling with our own coping behaviors, I think, at times. But if we can do our best to help ourselves and get the support that we need and model those healthy coping behaviors for children, not only will they pick up on them and hopefully start, using those strategies themselves, but they'll also have a greater sense of safety and comfort. And like I put here, have parents seek help if needed. So, if you're a parent or caregiver and you don't feel like you're able, during this time to show up and be there for your children as well as you would have been had this natural disaster not happen, I would suggest, reaching out and getting some extra, mental health support or physical support from a doctor if you need that as well. And then C, facilitate recovery. We want to try and normalize new routines and schedules as much as possible. I know this is difficult with everyone being at home right now, but if we can try and figure out a way to still, wake up children at a certain time, have them do showers and breakfast and get ready, and set aside certain times of the day where they're working on their academic work and parents are working on, what they need to work on, and also including time for breaks and play and recess and outdoor activities if that's possible. That's going to be helpful for kids because it makes them feel more grounded and stable if there's some sort of schedule versus just the day being open for whatever may happen. We want to listen to children and validate their feelings. So again, we don't want to say things like, there's nothing to be worried about, there's nothing to be afraid of. We want to let children know that we understand why they might be fearful and afraid right now, and that we're doing everything we can to help maintain their safety and the safety of the family. And we want to encourage activities that help them express their feelings. So again, play is a great way for children to express themselves. And I put art as well. Art can be a great way for kids to get in a different state of mind, relax, but also express, how they're feeling and be creative as well. Resiliency in the face of adversity. Most importantly, children are resilient. If I've learned anything in my time working with children over the years, it's that they are some of the most resilient little people I've ever met. I think regardless of ACEs or traumatic experiences, children have this way about them where they are, really able to bounce back during difficult times and show a great sense of strength. And of course, that all depends on where they lie on the spectrum of how they've been impacted by different degrees of trauma. But rest assured that children are, very resilient. And a statistic I found is that the most common factor that fosters resiliency in children is having at least one stable and trustworthy relationship with a supportive caregiver or adult. So if you are a parent or a caregiver or a therapist or teacher or someone who works with children or cares for children in any way, if you can be that adult in their life that they can trust and go to, you are really having a great impact on their ability to create a sense of resiliency in themselves that will carry them throughout their life and adulthood. And then finally, I put post-traumatic stress growth. This is a newer term I just kind of learned about, and it's basically this idea that the things we do when we're going through a traumatic or stressful time can actually help us after that period of time is over. So for example, children might be learning new things to get by and to cope, whether that's figuring out online school, figuring out ways to keep from getting too bored, how to get along with their siblings in such close quarters, and things like that. You know, I think children and all of us are having to come up with new skills and find new strengths within ourselves to get through this time. And what's great about this idea of post-traumatic stress growth is that once the traumatic event is over, these strengths actually stay with us and we begin to continue using them throughout our everyday life, and it helps us throughout the rest of our life to be more resilient. I wanted to give a list of some community resources. Like I said, I'm in the county of Sarasota in Florida, so these resources are for those of you in Sarasota County, but there are plenty of resources nationwide that are available to people right now as it relates to getting mental health or just support in general for your children and your family overall. I have here the Florida Center for Early Childhood. That is the organization that I work for. We provide mental health services to children ages 0 to 8 and some older children who are still school age depending on the circumstances. And so our website is thefloridacenter.org. And then we have Jewish Family Services, which has a 24/7 mobile response team for children in crisis. I am also a part of that mobile response team. We work with children and young adults, so anyone under the age of 25. Our number is listed there as 941-374-3213. Again, available 24/7. And then, of course, the Department of Children and Families, that is the local number, but it is available throughout the state of Florida and throughout the nation. And that is, you know, a place where we can call as parents if we're struggling and we need some extra supports. It's a place that we can call if we know of children that may not be our children, but maybe children that we work with or that we've seen that we're concerned about. Maybe their needs aren't being met during this time. You can call that number and notify them, and we can send some supports out, you know, to help parents and families during this time. Here's a list of the references I used. All of these are great articles where I got all this awesome information on how COVID-19 might be impacting our children. If you want to dig more and learn more information in depth, I recommend any of these articles here that I've posted. And then finally, if you have any questions for me, I am available. Again, my name is Liza Saffo. I am a social worker at the Florida Center for Early Childhood. My email is liza.saffo@thefloridacenter.org. And so if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I had a great time discussing this topic with you, and I hope it was helpful. Please take care and stay safe and healthy during this time.